Okay, now let's talk about price elasticity of supply, also called PES. Cryptically, right? Price elasticity of supply, and then it's PES. Who'd have thunk it? So, this is pretty much the same deal as price elasticity of demand, but for supply. You don't need to complicate it too much. So, it's how much does the quantity supplied or quantity that they're willing to supply change as a percentage divided by the change in price. So how much does 1% change in price affect the quantity that people are willing to sell at? It's typically positive because supply curves are typically upward sloping. They typically have a positive gradient. And how steep this is going to tell us, well, how much is quantity changing, and therefore what kind of value is the PES. So if the quantity is changing at around the same percentage as the price is changing, then the PES is going to be 1, and that's going to be a unitary good, because the amount by which the companies are willing to produce more goes up in the same percentage for any percentage change in price. So that would be unitary good. Happy days. Whereas if this was a very steep graph, well, what that's saying is that the price here on the y-axis is changing a lot for a very small change in quantity. So that's actually very inelastic. And the PES, well, we're looking at a small change in quantity relative to a bigger change in price. So this is going to be small, because if the numerator is bigger than the denominator, that's a fraction. That's less than 1. So this here is inelastic price elasticity of supply, which means that the PES is going to be under 1. It's going to be a normal fraction. And in contrast, the other type is when we have price to quantity, and quantity is very sensitive. So the quantity is changing at a higher ratio than the price. PES is going to be over 1, and it's going to be elastic in price elasticity of supply. What affects this? It's dependent on the costs. How much do the costs change? So if costs stay the same to produce for every good, they're completely irrelevant of each other. So, for example, a lesson doesn't really change in cost too much. When you deliver it, you go along, you plan, you deliver. I mean, maybe if you're delivering the same exact lesson again and again, then it's exactly the same. Then it's decreasing in cost because you can reuse plans. But if it's, new lessons from scratch, you need to design them and then deliver them. And then for another one, you need to design it and then deliver it, so on and so on. So that's the same cost. So what you're going to have is a small change in price is going to mean, hey, suddenly I'm going to be willing to deliver a load more, in theory. Assuming that I'm just somebody who wants money. It's going to be very price sensitive. It's going to be very elastic. A small increase in the price, going to be like, yippee, I can make a load more, because the cost of making one doesn't change that much. In contrast, with something like this is saying, hey, you actually need a very big increase in price to get me to produce more. That implies that the costs of making this thing are increasing very rapidly. And so you need a big increase in the price to cover the costs. So maybe an example is a theatre production in a small town. It's a weird example, but it's the first thing that came to my mind. So if I'm a theatre in a small town, well, first of all, I can employ some actors and some extras. I can run some rehearsals. But if I want to run more, then suddenly I need to find actors from out of town. It's going to be harder to find more extras, because it's easy to find some people who kind of could do with something to do on their Saturday afternoons, but finding more and more, it's going to become more and more difficult. I'm going to need to source more actors from out of town. I'm going to need to work out the logistics of how I can do all the rehearsals in the theatre space and them not interrupt each other. So the costs are going to be accelerating a fair bit. That means that it's likely that my price elasticity of supply is going to be more sensitive. And if you want more plays, well, get ready for theatres to become more expensive because you're going to need to have to pay a lot more to get the companies to produce a lot more, assuming that they've already covered their fixed costs of getting up and running. But that's a topic for another time. So it's effectively measuring how much are the costs increasing, and that's going to affect whether it's very inelastic, you need to pay a lot more to get them to produce more, or whether it's very elastic because the cost of producing a bit more, the variable cost, the cost that varies, cost as you're making more. People also call it the marginal cost. That implies that's very small because you only need to offer a smaller extra price to get people to produce more. So it's basically representing how much are the costs changing.